All right, so let's talk some more about protist evolution. All right, another big jump in protist evolution. So now bacteria have started to evolve into protists. So now protists have existed, and then at a certain point, I don't know the timeline on this one, but the protists eventually led to multicellular life like us and plants and funguses and things like that. So the first thing that we think happened is they started to live in cooperative groups, but they still all did generally the same job. So it's not like our body that has a lot of cells doing all sorts of different jobs. They were all kind of generally doing the same thing, and the term for that is a colony. And in this picture is a famous colony. It should be shown in the video. Again, I haven't watched the whole video yet. I'm still working on making the worksheet for the Protist movie for this week, but I would think these are so famous or sort of well known, I would think they're going to talk about it. So what we see here is called a volvox. So there you can see it there. So let's go back. And a volvox is a really well-known colony of algae. And so what we see here, it's weird. They're like this invisible area. They are sort of connected because you can see the membrane. So they must extend their membrane out and kind of attach them to each other. But these are all individual volvox cells living together, and they basically help each other. Probably helps with just being kind of more sturdy and grouping up, and then maybe they share carbohydrates that they create through photosynthesis, and they're able to, sort of help each other survive. And then these are new volvox colonies being made on the inside. And then here's one big colony with about 6 new ones inside that's probably just about to kind of burst open and release them. And actually, I'm thinking this one's pretty extreme. It's surprised it hasn't burst yet, because if you look, the other one, the 6 inside, are actually making new ones even inside them. So strangely, I don't know if I've actually ever referenced this, but the big one on the outside would be like the grandparent. These would be the parents, and then inside here would be like the new children. So we have like 3 generations of volvox. And again, part of why I like protists is they've got a lot of weird names that sound like aliens, because it is kind of an alien world that we're talking about here. So that makes sense that we would have alien-like names for them. All right, then over time, the cells in that colony started performing specialized jobs. So instead of all doing the same thing, like the volvox, they're all pretty much just kind of swimming around together and doing photosynthesis. Now we get something like this, which would represent the first simple multicellular organisms. So normally in class, I would ask questions like, okay, so we have clearly 2 different parts to this organism. And I usually say, okay, what do you think this part does? And because they do kind of look like leaves a little bit, but they're not. These are not plants. So only plants have leaves. But the function's probably pretty similar. They flattened out so they could do better photosynthesis, right? And then so most people get that, and then I go, okay, what do you think these did? So kind of think for a second, try to challenge yourself. What these ones down here, what purpose they might have been serving. And sometimes the first thought that people have is they're like roots, but that's not the case. Roots, again, are only in plants, and actually things like moss, simple plants like moss, don't even have roots. And so they wouldn't be for roots. So usually I clue, okay, they're in water, and they might even be in moving water, and then usually that's enough to get people to understand that these are like what they would use to like hold onto the rocks, so they don't get tossed all around, or maybe to the ground, but probably rocks or maybe on coral or something. And so these ones are getting all the energy and making the carbs, and then sharing it with these ones that are going to hold them in place so they don't get tossed around. So what we're seeing here is a very simple multicellular organism. Some cells doing photosynthesis, some cells holding them in place. Now we have the beginnings of multicellular life, which is our next thing that's incredibly important for us, which is the evolution of higher kingdoms. So the 3 different types of protists evolved into the 3 higher kingdoms of life. And we talked about this with your cladogram. And you were actually, if you remember the color scheme on your cladogram, the bacteria were like blue, I think. And then the protists were yellow, which is right here in yellow. And then the yellow was supposed to go into the green plants. The brown, I think the fungus was brown. And then the plants were red. So we see some similar colors here. And this would actually be the simplest cladogram you could make for the history of life. Bacteria evolved into protists, and protists evolved into plants, animals, and fungus. And so without the evolution of protists from bacteria, none of these kingdoms would exist, and we are also in this kingdom. So the evolution of protists is incredibly important, and why I'm talking a lot about it. All right, let's go over the three main protist types, and they're shown in this picture. In the video, we'll get into some of these types. And so over here are a bunch of cool-looking algae that are called diatoms, and the video definitely talks about diatoms. And this one's really amazing. It kind of has a star shape, so we see some really interesting geometry here. I mean, like perfect circles, right? Ovals, whatever, I don't know what that shape would be called, some kind of weird triangle. And diatoms have really amazing geometry that we don't normally see in living things. Here's another cool kind of triangle down here. And these are all different types of algae. And they can live not just in water, but also in soil and stuff. And then this is a slime mold. And then up here is a protozoan. And a protozoan is an animal protist, which we'll talk about. And I think this is a Euplotes. God, it's got these weird flagella. I've actually never looked at this. It almost looks like little toes. I've actually never looked this close at this picture. As I mentioned, if this is a Euplotes, I do think they kind of crawl around on plants, which I didn't know until I saw the video you're going to watch this week. And this would make sense that they're all sort of frazzled like that, because that would function maybe to help them walk around on the plant, just like toes help us kind of grip things and walk around. I'm surprised I've never noticed that. Anyway, all right, so we'll start with protozoan. So if we break this word down, again, a lot of this stuff I would normally do in class, but proto actually means first, and zo, you can probably guess where the zo comes from. There's not many words that have zo in them, and it comes from the word zoo, so this means the first animals. So these are the animal-like protists, and these tend to all be predators of some kind. So this is an amoeba, and over here we have a paramecium, and the food goes into this hole right here. Here's another picture of a paramecium. We find a lot of these in the lab we would normally do, and you can see there's different sizes of paramecium. Let's look at some cool amoebas. I really like this amoeba picture because it was done with an electron microscope, and normally they're not. And this is what it would look like if it was like in the room with you, like sitting on your desk or wherever you're sitting. If we could shrink ourselves down, this is what an amoeba would really look like. These are one larger predator killing a smaller predator. So just like we would have, let's say, if a mountain lion killed a coyote out in the mountains here. Same exact thing. So they've got their own food webs going on, where a large amoeba predator is doing phagocytosis to capture this paramecium. All right, here's a weird story. Usually by now I go, okay, how many people have heard of brain-eating amoeba? And usually some people raise their hands. It's a little older news now, but definitely weird. So probably some of you that have never heard of this are like, what? What is brain-eating amoeba? So let's talk about that. Okay, so when I first heard about these, there was an outbreak of these brain-eating amoeba that was occurring at some big like party lakes where people go and party. And I actually even heard about these lakes when I was in high school. I think they're in Arizona. And the most famous one, as far as I know, is called Lake Havasu. So if you've heard of that or ever been there, Havasu and some of the lakes around it developed these brain-eating amoeba. And it's a pretty weird story, and it kind of maybe even indicates that nature will fight back against stuff that we do to it, which we even talked about with the outbreak of certain viruses, that when we, like the outbreak of COVID-19 is seen as directly linked to these really gross, horrible animal markets in Asia in particular, and people are exposing themselves to these weird animal viruses in these horrible markets, and now we've got this COVID-19 outbreak, and it's almost a weird way like nature sort of fighting back. And so what was happening in these lakes is people were partying in them for years, I mean maybe decades really, because it was probably 20 years after I graduated high school that I heard this story. So yeah, so like decades of partying in this lake, and they're dumping trash, maybe oil from the boat, all sorts of waste, food and alcohol waste, because again, people are partying there, and as well as poop and pee. There's going to be some kid in a diaper that's pooping in the water. whatever. And eventually, brain-eating amoeba evolved and developed in this lake. And again, this is why I describe it as almost like nature fighting back. And so what we see is it can go through different forms. So here is in a flagella form, and then it actually transforms into an amoeba form. And then if we follow this arrow, you can see it's going up this kid's nose. So what they think was happening, or I think what's been proven, is that especially kids who don't really block up their nose when they're swimming as well, were getting the water up their nose, and these amoebas were getting up in here, and they were making their way into the brain cavity, and they were consuming the brains of these people that got it. So it's pretty weird, and it sounds like a sci-fi movie, but it's not. And they had to close off the lakes and do a quarantine, just like we're in a quarantine right now. They had to quarantine the lakes and try to get this under control and clean them up. And I think maybe things are back to normal now, but I have had students that have said they've seen warning signs at certain lakes about it and stuff, and it's definitely kind of a weird and unfortunate situation. So here's some actual photos. So here we can see it in its flagella form with the two flagella coming off, and then we see some amoeba forms, and then this is a third form where they kind of like hibernate.